Russia's history with nuclear weapons is deeply intertwined with the Cold War, its role as the Soviet Union, and its position as one of the two superpowers in the 20th century. Soviet Union's development of nuclear weapons. 1940s first nuclear weapon test. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, successfully tested its first nuclear weapon on August 29, 1949, at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. This test, code-named First Lightning, came 4 years after the United States had dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The Soviet Union's nuclear program began in earnest during World War II, influenced by espionage and the knowledge of the U.S. Manhattan Project. Key figures like Igor Kurchatov and Andrei Sakharov were pivotal in developing the bomb. The Cold War and the nuclear arms race, 1950s–1980s. Nuclear arms race. The US and the Soviet Union became engaged in a bitter arms race to develop more powerful and diverse nuclear arsenals. The US had already developed the atomic bomb, but the Soviets rapidly expanded their nuclear capabilities, including the hydrogen bomb, H-bomb. Soviet H-bomb. In 1953, the Soviet Union detonated its first hydrogen bomb, a massive leap forward in its nuclear capabilities. This marked the beginning of a strategic competition between the superpowers to build increasingly more powerful nuclear weapons. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. This was perhaps the most dangerous confrontation during the Cold War, precipitated by the Soviet placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba. The crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, with both the US and the USSR deploying massive amounts of nuclear weapons in preparation for a potential conflict. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. As tensions mounted, both sides sought to curb the escalation of nuclear arsenals. The SALT-I, 1972, and SALT-II, 1979, treaties were agreements between the US and the Soviet Union to limit the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and other nuclear weapons. The Soviet Nuclear Doctrine. The Soviet Union developed a doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD, which posited that a nuclear war between the US and USSR would result in the complete annihilation of both sides, acting as a deterrent against the actual use of nuclear weapons. The Soviet military doctrine emphasized the use of nuclear weapons for deterrence, not first strike capability, though there was also a policy of escalation dominance, meaning the Soviets would be willing to escalate a conflict with conventional forces into a nuclear one if necessary. Post-Soviet era collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia inherited the Soviet nuclear arsenal, which included thousands of nuclear warheads, missile systems, and bombers. Nuclear disarmament and treaties. In the 1990s, Russia participated in several arms control agreements with the US, including the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START-I, in 1991, which led to the reduction of both countries' nuclear arsenals. This was followed by START-II, 1993, and New START, 2010, which further reduced strategic nuclear weapons. Nuclear doctrine in the post-Soviet period. In the 21st century, Russia's nuclear doctrine has evolved. The 2000 Russian military doctrine stated that nuclear weapons could be used in the event of a conventional attack that threatened the survival of the Russian state. This concept has been retained in later versions of the doctrine, with the potential use of nuclear weapons to defend against a wide range of threats. Recent developments. Modernization of nuclear forces. Russia has focused heavily on modernizing its nuclear forces, developing new weapon systems such as the Sarmat ICBM, the Avangard hypersonic missile, and the Poseidon underwater drone. These are seen as responses to the perceived threats posed by NATO and US missile defense systems. Use of nuclear rhetoric. In recent years, Russian leaders, especially President Vladimir Putin, have occasionally invoked nuclear weapons in the context of military threats. For example, in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, Putin has repeatedly warned of the possibility of using nuclear weapons to defend Russia's territorial integrity. This has raised concerns about the potential for nuclear escalation. Russia's nuclear strategy. The Russian military doctrine, updated in 2020, emphasized the possibility of using nuclear weapons in response to non-nuclear strategic threats, including cyber attacks or large-scale conventional warfare, signaling a more flexible approach to nuclear weapons in Russian defense strategy. Present-day Ukraine war and nuclear concerns. 2022 present. The war in Ukraine, which began in February 2022, has further amplified concerns about the potential use of nuclear weapons. Russian officials have occasionally made veiled threats regarding the use of nuclear weapons, particularly in the context of NATO support for Ukraine and Western sanctions. In September 2022, Russia held referenda in Ukrainian territories it had annexed, prompting threats of nuclear retaliation if these areas were attacked. The rhetoric around nuclear weapons has been a significant point of concern for global security. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to heightened fears that Russia may use tactical nuclear weapons, though there is no evidence that such a move is imminent. Nevertheless, the war has made the world more aware of the risks of nuclear escalation. Global nuclear non-proliferation and Russia's role. Russia remains a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, which aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, promote disarmament, and encourage peaceful nuclear cooperation. However, Russia's stance on nuclear disarmament has become more conservative in recent years, particularly in the context of rising tensions with the West. In recent years, Russia has argued that the US and NATO's actions, including missile defense installations in Europe, undermine nuclear arms control agreements and may lead to an arms race. Conclusion: Russia's nuclear history is marked by its rapid development of nuclear weapons during the Soviet era, its strategic use of nuclear deterrence throughout the Cold War, and its continued emphasis on nuclear deterrence in the post-Soviet period. While Russia has participated in arms reduction efforts and has been a key player in the global non-proliferation regime, its growing reliance on nuclear weapons in its military doctrine, along with its more aggressive posturing in recent conflicts, has heightened concerns about the potential use of nuclear weapons in the modern era. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday lowered the threshold for a nuclear strike in response to a broader range of conventional attacks, and Moscow said Ukraine had struck deep inside Russia with US-made ATACMS missiles. Putin approved the change days after two U.S. officials and a source familiar with the decision said on Sunday that U.S. President Joe Biden's administration allowed Ukraine to use U.S.-made weapons to strike deep into Russia. Russia had been warning the West for months that if Washington allowed Ukraine to fire U.S., British and French missiles deep into Russia, Moscow would consider those NATO members to be directly involved in the war in Ukraine. The updated Russian nuclear doctrine, establishing a framework for conditions under which Putin could order a strike from the world's biggest nuclear arsenal, was approved by him on Tuesday, according to a published decree. Analysts said the biggest change was that Russia could consider a nuclear strike in response to a conventional attack on Russia or its ally Belarus that created a critical threat to their sovereignty and/or their territorial integrity. The big picture is that Russia is lowering the threshold for a nuclear strike in response to a possible conventional attack, said Alexander Graf, a senior researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. The previous doctrine, contained in a 2020 decree, said Russia may use nuclear weapons in case of a nuclear attack by an enemy or a conventional attack that threatened the existence of the state. The U.S. National Security Council said it had not seen any reason to adjust the U.S. nuclear posture. Together, Russia and the US control 88% of the world's nuclear warheads. Putin is the primary decision-maker on the use of Russia's nuclear arsenal. The doctrine said any attack by a non-nuclear power supported by a nuclear power would be considered a joint attack, and that any attack by one member of a military bloc would be considered an attack by the entire alliance, it said. Russia's defense ministry said Ukraine had struck Russia's Bryansk region with 6 missiles and that air defense systems intercepted 5 and damaged 1. We will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia and we will react accordingly, Putin's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, said in English, adding that US personnel and data must have been used in the ATACMS attack on Russia. Lavrov said Russia would do everything to avoid nuclear war, and pointed out that it was the US which used nuclear weapons against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. On the 1000th day of the Ukraine war, Russia also included a broader definition of the data that could be used to indicate Russia was under mass attack from aircraft, cruise missiles and unpiloted aircraft. The war is entering what some Russian and Western officials say could be its final and most dangerous phase as Moscow's forces advance at their fastest pace since the early weeks of the conflict and the West ponders how the war will end.